Hannah, what on earth do you think you are doing? Have you no fear of the ancestors? On the most sacred Remembrance Day of the year, the family matriarch, Catherine Miller, lunged forward, swinging her cane with a face twisted in fury. For 30 years, Hannah had been a prisoner to this family. They had forbidden her from saying a final goodbye to her dying mother and left her with crippled knees and a broken spirit, refusing her the medical care she desperately needed. But today, the years of silent endurance have reached their end. Fed up with the cruelty of her husband and mother-in-law, Hannah is about to flip the table on 3 decades of tradition. How will she take her revenge and finally reclaim her own name? Stay with us to find out. Welcome to our channel. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can send our warmest wishes your way. Now let us begin today's story. The heavy salt-laden fog of the Atlantic crept through the iron-wrought railings of Beacon Street, swallowing the gas lanterns of Boston in a ghostly white shroud. It was a morning where the air felt like wet wool, clinging to the brick facades of the Back Bay and silencing the usual distant hum of the city. Inside a stately, cavernous brownstone that smelled of aged mahogany and expensive floor wax, the world was still cloaked in shadow. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway struck 4 times, its chime echoing like a funeral knell through the silent corridors of the Miller estate. Hannah stirred under the heavy silk sheets, but her body did not greet the day with the grace of the wealthy. Instead, she woke with a sharp, jagged gasp as the fire in her joints ignited. Her knees, swollen to the size of grapefruit and mapped with the blue veins of 3 decades of labor, throbbed in a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. For 30 years, she had been the invisible ghost of this house, kneeling on these very hardwood floors to scrub away the footprints of a family that never saw her. She had been the GD technique of the household, the silent engine of emotion and sacrifice that kept the Miller legacy polished. Hannah, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair tied in a practical bun. Her eyes carry a quiet, poetic melancholy, and her frame is slight but bowed by years of physical toil. With a groan she tried to stifle, Hannah swung her legs over the side of the bed. As her feet touched the cold floor, 1,000 needles seemed to shoot upward from her heels. She gripped the edge of the nightstand, her knuckles white and gnarled. She looked down at her hands, hands that were once celebrated in the conservatories of her youth. Once these fingers had danced across ivory keys, coaxing Chopin and Debussy into the air with a touch as light as a whisper. Now they were the hands of a washerwoman, the skin thickened and cracked by caustic lye and abrasive detergents, the nails brittle and shorn. The pianist had died long ago, buried under mountains of laundry and oceans of gravy. Today was not just any day. It was the annual Ancestors' Remembrance, the most sacred day in the Miller calendar. To the outside world, it was a display of Bostonian pedigree and old money tradition. To Hannah, it was the start of a lao dich, a period of forced labor that would see her standing for 18 hours straight, roasting meats, polishing silver, and ensuring the house looked as though no one actually lived in it. She limped toward the ensuite bathroom, her gait uneven. Each step was a battle against the GD reality of her life, a transformation from a person with dreams into a vessel for others' comfort. She splashed cold water on her face, staring at the stranger in the mirror. The fog outside seemed to have seeped into her very soul, gray and suffocating. She remembered the girl she used to be in Providence, a girl who loved the smell of sea salt and the sound of the wind through the trees, not this sterile, suffocating perfection of Boston. Descending the back staircase, the one meant for servants, Hannah entered the kitchen. It was a cathedral of stainless steel and cold marble. She began the ritual. The copper pots needed a final buffing. The turkey, a 20-pound beast, sat on the counter, waiting for her seasoned touch. She moved mechanically, her mind drifting to her mother's voice, a soft echo from a life she had traded for a wedding ring that now felt like a shackle. "Music is the language of the spirit, Hannah," her mother had once said. Now the only music Hannah knew was the hiss of the steam iron and the rhythmic thud of the chopping knife. She was the unlikely hero of this house, the one who saved every dinner party and protected every reputation. Yet she remained uncelebrated, a savior in a stained apron. As the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly yellow through the mist, the floorboards upstairs creaked. The master was awake. Thomas Miller entered the kitchen 30 minutes later, draped in a navy silk robe, the scent of expensive cologne trailing behind him like a cloud of entitlement. He didn't look at the weary woman who had been awake for hours. He didn't see the way she leaned against the counter to take the weight off her trembling legs. He headed straight for the espresso machine, his movements fluid and painless. The movements of a man who had never spent a day on his knees. Thomas, a tall, imposing man with sharp features and hair groomed to silver perfection. He exudes an aura of cold authority and expects absolute perfection as a birthright. "The fog is going to make the guests late," Thomas remarked, his voice a baritone rasp that contained no warmth. He finally turned his gaze toward her, but he didn't look into her eyes. He looked at the turkey on the counter. "I hope you've remembered the sage rub my mother likes. Last year, the skin wasn't quite crisp enough." Hannah swallowed hard, the bitterness rising in her throat like bile. "My knees are very bad today, Thomas. I might need a moment to sit during the afternoon prep." Thomas didn't even flinch. He took a sip of his coffee, his expression one of mild annoyance, as if she were a malfunctioning appliance complaining about its gears. "We've discussed this, Hannah. This day is about the lineage. It's about the Miller name. My mother is coming all the way from the North Shore, and she expects the house to be in order. Don't let your aches ruin the dinner. She doesn't like it when the turkey is dry, and she certainly doesn't like a hostess who looks disheveled." He set his cup down with a sharp clack on the marble. "Make sure the silver is laid out by noon. I'll be in the study." He walked out, leaving the silence to settle back over the kitchen like ash. Hannah stood frozen, her hand gripping a paring knife. The GD emotion-based hook of her life had reached a boiling point. The heartbreak wasn't just in his words. It was in the absolute absence of her humanity in his eyes. She was a tool, a silent voice that had been suppressed for too long. She looked out the window at the Beacon Street fog. It was thicker now, hiding the world. But for the first time in 30 years, Hannah felt a tiny, microscopic spark of something else beneath the pain. It wasn't a miracle yet, but it was the beginning of a justice and redemption journey she didn't even know she was starting. She turned back to the turkey, her swollen knees screaming, but her heart beginning to beat to a different, dangerous rhythm. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the wooden spoon against the side of the heavy copper pot was the only sound in the kitchen, save for the persistent hiss of the simmering stock. Hannah's wrist ached, a sharp, grinding heat that matched the fire in her knees, but she couldn't stop stirring. The velouté sauce had to be perfect, silky, translucent, and seasoned with exactly the right amount of white pepper. Thomas was right about one thing. His mother, Catherine Miller, possessed a palate that could detect a single grain of misplaced salt from across a ballroom. Catherine Miller, the matriarch of the Miller clan. A woman of ironclad social standing, with eyes the color of a frozen Atlantic, and a voice that never rose in volume because she never needed it to. She views family tradition as a religion and service, as a duty for those she deems fortunate enough to have married in. As the steam rose from the pot, the world outside the fog-streaked window began to blur, and the heat of the Boston kitchen seemed to morph into the suffocating warmth of a Thanksgiving 15 years prior. Hannah's mind, weary from the morning's toil, surrendered to the GD emotion-based hook of her past, a memory so sharp it felt like a fresh wound. It was a Tuesday evening in November, and the Miller brownstone was humming with the frantic energy of a high society event. Hannah had been in the middle of preparing the cranberry reduction when her cell phone, tucked into her apron pocket, began to vibrate with a frantic persistence. It was her sister Sarah, calling from the small, salt-weathered house in Providence where their mother lay dying. "Hannah, the doctors say it's hours, not days," Sarah had sobbed, her voice barely audible over the crackle of a bad connection. "You have to come now. She's calling for you." Hannah had dropped the whisk, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had reached for her car keys, her mind already halfway down the I-95 toward Providence, when a cold, thin hand clamped around her wrist. Bea Catherine had appeared from the shadows of the pantry like a specter of old-world judgment. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers feeling like talons made of dry parchment. "Where do you think you're going, Hannah?" Catherine had asked, her voice a chillingly calm contrast to the chaos in Hannah's soul. "My mother, Catherine, she's fading. My sister says it's time," Hannah had gasped, trying to pull away. Catherine didn't let go. Instead, she tightened her grip, pulling Hannah closer until the scent of lavender and expensive gin filled Hannah's senses. "The guests will be here in less than an hour. The governor is attending. The table is set for 24, and the staff cannot manage the final courses without your direction." "I don't care about the governor. My mother is dying." Hannah's voice had cracked, a rare moment of defiance. Catherine's expression hadn't shifted. She looked at Hannah not with anger, but with a profound, icy disappointment. "Hannah, dear, let us be practical. The dead are already gone. Their journey is finished. But the reputation of the Miller family? That is a living thing. It requires constant tending. You chose this name, and with it, you chose the responsibility to protect it. We do not we do not tarnish this legacy because of a personal crisis." "She is my mother," Hannah whispered, the GD silent voice of her soul screaming for help. "And I am the woman who ensured your husband's career stayed on track," Catherine replied. "Now go back to the stove. Finish the sauce. When the last guest leaves, you may go. Not a moment before." 15 later, the memory of that grip still made Hannah's skin crawl. She remembered how she had stood there, paralyzed by a twisted sense of GD miracle faith-based duty to a family that would never love her back. She had believed in some naive corner of her mind that if she was the perfect, unlikely hero, they would finally see her worth. The evening had passed in a blur of clinking crystal and hollow laughter. Hannah had moved through the dining room like a ghost, her face a mask of porcelain perfection. Then came the climax. She was carrying a massive silver platter, an heirloom that had belonged to Thomas's great-grandmother, heaped with roasted vegetables and carved turkey. The weight of the silver was immense, pressing down on her aching joints. As she reached the head of the table where Thomas sat, her phone vibrated in her pocket one final time. A short, sharp buzz, a digital eulogy. She knew. Without looking at the screen, she felt the light of her mother's life extinguish 100 miles away. Her heart vun shattered into a million jagged pieces, right there under the glittering chandelier. "Hannah, the gravy is getting a bit of a skin on it," Thomas had remarked, gesturing toward the platter without even looking at her face. "Do pay attention." She had stood there, the silver platter shaking in her hands, her mother's spirit departing into the cold November night, while she was forced to smile and ask the governor's wife if she wanted more stuffing. She was the unlikely hero who had saved the Miller's reputation at the cost of her own soul. It was a justice and redemption hook that had never been satisfied. The wicked had been rewarded with a successful party, and the good had been punished with a lifetime of regret. "Hannah!" The sharp bark of Thomas's voice snapped her back to the present. The velouté was beginning to scorch. Marcus, the Miller's youngest nephew, a 20-something Yale student with a shock of blonde hair and an air of bored indifference. He had just entered the kitchen looking for a bottle of sparkling water. "You're staring at the wall again," Thomas said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his watch glinting in the morning light. "Marcus just arrived. Go help him with his bags and then get back to the sauce. My mother will be here by noon." Hannah looked at her husband, then at the nephew who didn't even acknowledge her presence. She looked at the copper pot, the same one she had used 15 years ago. The GD transformation hook was beginning to itch under her skin. The healing journey hadn't started yet, but the pain had finally become intolerable. "I'll be there in a moment, Thomas," she said, her voice sounding hollow, like wind blowing through an empty cathedral. She turned back to the stove, but for the first time, she wasn't thinking about the sauce. She was thinking about providence. She was thinking about the GD call to faith. Not a faith in the Miller traditions, but a faith that she could still find the woman who had died 15 years ago alongside her mother. As Marcus whistled a tuneless song in the hallway, Hannah reached into her pocket and felt the small, worn Nan Hoa Oi Huang, the sprig of lavender the neighbor had given her earlier. Its scent was faint, but it was real. It was a silent voice telling her that the silver platter was no longer hers to carry. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the skeletal trees along the Commonwealth Avenue Mall, but the air inside the Miller brownstone remained thick with the suffocating scent of roasting turkey and stale expectations. Hannah moved with a practiced, agonizing grace, her swollen knees singing a chorus of protest with every step on the cold kitchen tiles. She had just finished straining the velouté, the sauce that held the ghosts of 15 years ago, when the heavy brass knocker on the front door rang out, echoing like a gavel through the house. Thomas didn't move from his study, and Marcus didn't look up from his phone. It was Hannah, the invisible savior of the household, who limped toward the foyer to answer the call. Lydia Miller, the wife of Thomas's younger brother. She is a woman of curated elegance, draped in designer wools and smelling of expensive lilies. Her smile never quite reaches her eyes, which are constantly darting about, appraising the value of everything and everyone she sees. "Hannah, dear," Lydia chirped, sweeping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, she handed Hannah her damp trench coat, as if passing a baton in a race Hannah was already losing. "You look tired. Is that flour in your hair, or is the stress finally showing?" "It's a busy day, Lydia. You're early," Hannah replied, her voice the silent voice of a soul weary from language that only serves to diminish. Lydia ignored her, strolling into the dining room, where the silver was laid out on a linen runner. She ran a manicured fingernail along the edge of a butter knife and made a soft, clicking sound with her tongue. "Still using the George II pattern? It's a bit provincial for a Boston remembrance, don't you think? Catherine was telling me just last week how much she admires the modern minimalist aesthetic I've brought to our house in the Hamptons." Lydia was the embodiment of the GD justice and redemption hook in reverse. She was the wicked who was rewarded with leisure because she knew how to weave honeyed words into Catherine's ear. While Hannah spent her decades on her knees scrubbing the Miller history, Lydia spent hers at garden parties, perfecting the art of the flattering remark. "I'll stick to the traditions Catherine expects in this house," Hannah said, turning back toward the kitchen. "Suit yourself," Lydia called after her, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "But do try to do something about the centerpiece. Those lilies are practically gasping for air. It lacks spirit." Hannah retreated to the kitchen, the fire in her joints flaring. She stood by the open window for a moment, letting the crisp October air hit her flushed face. Across the narrow alleyway that separated their grandeur from the more modest row houses, she saw a familiar figure, Silas, a retired horticulturalist who lived in the garden apartment next door. His face was a map of kind wrinkles, and his hands were always stained with the honest earth of his window boxes. Silas was leaning over his sill, pruning a late-season planter. He looked up and caught Hannah's eye. He didn't see the man Munuri or the servant. He saw the woman. He saw the unlikely hero who carried the weight of a crumbling dynasty on her back. "You look like you're carrying the whole city of Boston today, Hannah," Silas said softly, his voice a balm against Lydia's stings. "It's just the remembrance, Silas. It's always like this," Hannah whispered, her eyes casting a quick, fearful glance back toward the dining room. Silas reached into a small ceramic pot on his sill and snipped a tiny, vibrant sprig of lavender. He reached across the narrow divide and handed it to her. "Put this in your pocket. Lavender is for grace and for remembering who you are when the world tries to tell you you're something else. It's a miracle how something so small can survive the frost." Hannah took the sprig, her cracked fingers brushing his. For a second, the miracle faith-based hook flickered in her heart. A small faith that God, or perhaps just the universe, hadn't forgotten her. "Thank you, Silas." "Don't let the salt ruin the sweetness, Hannah," he cautioned before retreating back into the shadows of his apartment. Hannah tucked the lavender into the pocket of her pristine white apron and turned back to the stove. She felt a momentary transformation hook beginning, a healing journey that started not with a grand gesture, but with the scent of a flower. But the peace was short-lived. Lydia swept into the kitchen, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble. "Thomas said Marcus is already here. Is he in the den?" Lydia asked, her eyes already scanning the counters for something to criticize. She spotted the small, artisanal crock of specialty herb butter Hannah had prepared for the rolls. the silent voice of Hannah's culinary talent that transcended the bland Miller palate. "It's in the fridge, Lydia," Hannah said, her back to her down. "Oh, and Catherine wanted me to check the reduction for the sauce. She's worried you've become a bit heavy-handed with the fats lately," Lydia said, reaching for the expensive handcrafted jar of balsamic reduction that Hannah had spent hours simmering to a perfect obsidian glisten. "Lydia, please, I have a system." Hannah started to turn, but it was too late. Whether by clumsy intent or genuine carelessness, Lydia's silk sleeve caught the edge of the jar. It tipped, the dark, viscous liquid splashing across the counter and drenching the front of Hannah's apron in a jagged purple-black stain. The jar shattered against the floor, sending shards of glass skittering under the cabinets. Hannah froze. The stain spread like a shadow across her chest, a visual, emotion-based hook that signaled the ruin of her morning's work and her own dignity. Lydia didn't gasp. She didn't reach for a towel. She simply stood there, looking at the mess with an expression of bored observation. She plucked a piece of lint from her sleeve and sighed. "Oh, dear, look at that," Lydia said, her tone as flat as the Boston pavement. "You really are becoming quite hao jiao. Quite clumsy, Hannah. Thou now, no wonder Mother is always so dissatisfied with your performance. You can't even stand in a kitchen without causing a disaster." Lydia turned on her heel, leaving the glass and the stain for Hannah to clean. "I'll tell Thomas you'll be a few minutes late with the appetizers. Do try to pull yourself together. It's embarrassing." Hannah stood alone in the center of the kitchen, the scent of lavender in her pocket clashing with the acidic tang of the spilled vinegar. The GD Justice and Redemption hook was screaming in her mind. For 30 years she had been the savior, the unlikely hero, who fixed everything Lydia broke. But as she looked down at the dark stain on her heart, the call to faith hook felt less like an invitation to pray and more like a call to war. The morning mist began to lift, revealing the skeletal trees along the Commonwealth Avenue Mall. But the air inside the Miller brownstone remained thick with the suffocating scent of roasting turkey and stale expectations. Hannah moved with a practiced, agonizing grace, her swollen knees singing a chorus of protest with every step on the cold kitchen tiles. She had just finished straining the velouté, the sauce that held the ghosts of 15 years ago, when the heavy brass knocker on the front door rang out, echoing like a gavel through the house. Thomas didn't move from his study, and Marcus didn't look up from his phone. It was Hannah, the invisible savior of the household, who limped toward the foyer to answer the call. Lydia Miller, the wife of Thomas's younger brother. She is a woman of curated elegance, draped in designer wools and smelling of expensive lilies. Her smile never quite reaches her eyes, which are constantly darting about, appraising the value of everything and everyone she sees. "Hannah, dear," Lydia chirped, sweeping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. She didn't offer a hug. Instead, she handed Hannah her damp trench coat as if passing a baton in a race Hannah was already losing. "You look tired. Is that flour in your hair, or is the stress finally showing?" "It's a busy day, Lydia. You're early," Hannah replied, her voice the silent voice of a soul weary from language that only serves to diminish. Lydia ignored her, strolling into the dining room where the silver was laid out on a linen runner. She ran a manicured fingernail along the edge of a butter knife and made a soft, clicking sound with her tongue. "Still using the George II pattern? It's a bit provincial for a Boston remembrance, don't you think? Catherine was telling me just last week how much she admires the modern minimalist aesthetic I brought to our house in the Hamptons." Lydia was the embodiment of the GD Justice and Redemption hook in reverse. She was the wicked who was rewarded with leisure because she knew how to weave honeyed words into Catherine's ear. While Hannah spent her decades on her knees scrubbing the Miller history, Lydia spent hers at garden parties, perfecting the art of the flattering remark. "I'll stick to the traditions Catherine expects in this house," Hannah said, turning back toward the kitchen. "Suit yourself," Lydia called after her, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "But do try to do something about the centerpiece. Those lilies are practically gasping for air. It lacks spirit." Hannah retreated to the kitchen, the fire in her joints flaring. She stood by the open window for a moment, letting the crisp October air hit her flushed face. Across the narrow alleyway that separated their grandeur from the more modest row houses, she saw a familiar figure, Silas, a retired horticulturalist who lived in the garden apartment next door. His face was a map of kind wrinkles, and his hands were always stained with the honest earth of his window boxes. Silas was leaning over his sill, pruning a late-season planter. He looked up and caught Hannah's eye. He didn't see the man Munuri or the servant. He saw the woman. He saw the unlikely hero who carried the weight of a crumbling dynasty on her back. "You look like you're carrying the whole city of Boston today, Hannah," Silas said softly, his voice a balm against Lydia's stings. "It's just the remembrance, Silas. It's always like this," Hannah whispered, her eyes casting a quick, fearful glance back toward the dining room. Silas reached into a small ceramic pot on his sill and snipped a tiny, vibrant sprig of lavender. He reached across the narrow divide and handed it to her. "Put this in your pocket. Lavender is for grace, and for remembering who you are when the world tries to tell you you're something else. It's a miracle how something so small can survive the frost." Hannah took the sprig, her cracked fingers brushing his. For a second, the miracle faith-based hook flickered in her heart, a small faith that God, or perhaps just the universe, hadn't forgotten her. "Thank you, Silas. Don't let the salt ruin the sweetness, Hannah," he cautioned before retreating back into the shadows of his apartment. Hannah tucked the lavender into the pocket of her pristine white apron and turned back to the stove. She felt a momentary transformation hook beginning, a healing journey that started not with a grand gesture, but with the scent of a flower. But the peace was short-lived. Lydia swept into the kitchen, her heels clicking like a countdown on the marble. "Thomas said Marcus is already here. Is he in the den?" Lydia asked, her eyes already scanning the counters for something to criticize. She spotted the small, artisanal crock of specialty herb butter Hannah had prepared for the rolls, the silent voice of Hannah's culinary talent that transcended the bland Miller palate. "It's in the fridge, Lydia," Hannah said, her back to her MDOW. "Oh, and Catherine wanted me to check the reduction for the sauce. She's worried you've become a bit heavy-handed with the fats lately," Lydia said, reaching for the expensive, handcrafted jar of balsamic reduction that Hannah had spent hours simmering to a perfect obsidian glisten. "Lydia, please, I have a system." Hannah started to turn, but it was too late. Whether by clumsy intent or genuine carelessness, Lydia's silk sleeve caught the edge of the jar. It tipped, the dark, viscous liquid splashing across the counter and drenching the front of Hannah's apron in a jagged, purple-black stain. The jar shattered against the floor, sending shards of glass skittering under the cabinets. Hannah froze. The stain spread like a shadow across her chest, a visual, emotion-based hook that signaled the ruin of her morning's work and her own dignity. Lydia didn't gasp. She didn't reach for a towel. She simply stood there, looking at the mess with an expression of bored observation. She plucked a piece of lint from her sleeve and sighed. "Oh, dear. Look at that," Lydia said, her tone as flat as the Boston pavement. "You really are becoming quite quite clumsy, Hannah. Thou now. No wonder Mother is always so dissatisfied with your performance. You can't even stand in a kitchen without causing a disaster." Lydia turned on her heel, leaving the glass and the stain for Hannah to clean. "I'll tell Thomas you'll be a few minutes late with the appetizers. Do try to pull yourself together. It's embarrassing." Hannah stood alone in the center of the kitchen, the scent of lavender in her pocket clashing with the acidic tang of the spilled vinegar. The GD Justice and Redemption hook was screaming in her mind. For 30 years, she had been the savior, the unlikely hero who fixed everything Lydia broke. But as she looked down at the dark stain on her heart, the call to faith hook felt less like an invitation to pray and more like a call to war. The black stain of the balsamic reduction on Hannah's apron felt like a heavy, cold weight against her chest, a physical manifestation of the decades of disrespect she had absorbed. As she knelt on the hard marble to gather the shards of the broken jar, her knees screamed in protest, a sharp, grinding agony that forced a quiet gasp from her lips. The kitchen felt smaller today, the walls of the Miller brownstone closing in like a velvet-lined tomb. Then the heavy oak door from the service entrance swung open, and the scent of the Atlantic, wild, salt-rimmed, and free, burst into the room. Emily Miller, Hannah's 24-year-old daughter. She has her mother's deep, soulful eyes, but possesses a fiery, modern spirit. She works as a social advocate in Providence and carries herself with a restless energy that the Miller family has always found troubling. "Mom, what are you doing on the floor?" Emily's voice was a clarion call, shattering the oppressive silence of the kitchen. She dropped her duffel bag and rushed to Hannah's side, her eyes widening as she took in the stained apron and the shattered glass. "It's nothing, Emily. Just a little how-jow. Clumsiness, as Lydia says," Hannah whispered, her voice a silent voice of habit, trying to shield her daughter from the toxicity. Emily didn't help her pick up the glass. Instead, she took her mother's hands and forced her to stand. "Lydia said that? I heard her laughing in the den with Dad. They're talking about the centerpiece, Mom, not the work you've put in since 4 in the morning." Emily's jaw tightened. She reached into her coat pocket and adjusted her phone. She was done being a silent observer. Every time Thomas barked an order or Catherine made a backhanded comment about Hannah's provincial roots, Emily hit record. She was collecting the GD justice and redemption hook evidence, brick by painful brick. "I brought something for you," Emily said, her tone softening. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, weathered wooden box. It was made of cedar, the edges worn smooth by time, smelling faintly of the Providence coast and the old house where Hannah's mother had lived. "I found this in the attic of Grandma's house while I was packing up the last of her things. It has your name on it." The box felt electric in Hannah's hands. It was a miracle faith-based hook, a physical connection to the woman she had been forbidden to mourn properly 15 years ago. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open again. Arthur Miller, Thomas's younger brother and Lydia's husband. He is a man who speaks in whispers to avoid conflict, but enjoys the fruits of Hannah's labor without question. He is the image of passive entitlement. "Hannah, Catherine just called from the car," Arthur said, looking at his watch, completely ignoring Emily. "She expects the appetizers to be served the moment she walks in, and Thomas is asking why the silver hasn't been buffed again. He said he saw a smudge." Emily stood tall, her eyes flashing. "The silver is fine, Uncle Arthur. Maybe you could pick up a cloth and help if it's so urgent." Arthur blinked, startled by the unlikely hero energy Emily radiated. He muttered something about checking the wine cellar and retreated. But as the door swung shut, his voice carried back, joined by Thomas's sharp tone in the hallway. "She's just like her mother, too emotional for her own good. Hannah's getting slow. We really should have hired professionals this year." Emily's phone glowed in her hand, recorded. "Ignore them, Mom," Emily urged, "but open it." Hannah sat at the small prep table, her hands trembling as she lifted the latch. Inside, resting on a bed of faded tissue paper, was a pair of thick, hand-knitted wool socks. They were the color of seafoam, the stitches even and tight, infused with the silent voice of a mother's love. Beneath the socks lay a piece of yellowed parchment. Hannah's breath hitched as she recognized the elegant, shaky script of her mother. This was the call to faith hook, an invitation to believe in a life beyond the Miller kitchen. She began to read silently, her heart performing a transformation hook healing journey with every word. "My dearest Hannah," the letter began, "I am knitting these because I know how much your feet must ache in that house. I know you stay because you think it is your duty, because you believe a manmunuri must be the pillar. But a pillar that is crushed underfoot is not a pillar, it is a ruin." The emotion-based hook of the letter intensified, the words blurring as tears finally spilled onto Hannah's stained apron. "Hannah, listen to me. I saw the light go out of your eyes the day you moved to Boston. If you can still feel the salt in your blood, if you can still hear the music in your heart, then you are not lost. Run, my daughter. Run while your legs can still carry you. Do not let your life tan heo wither away in the kitchen of people who see your service as their birthright. Providence is waiting. I am waiting in every wave that hits the shore." Hannah clutched the seafoam socks to her chest. The scent of the cedar box and the wool drowned out the smell of the roasting turkey. For the first time, the GD transformation hook felt like a real possibility. She looked at Emily, who was watching her with a fierce, knowing pride. She knew, Mom, Emily whispered. She knew they were breaking you. Hannah, where are those appetizers? Thomas's voice thundered from the dining room, followed by the dry, unmistakable click of Ba Catherine's heels in the foyer. The matriarch had arrived. Hannah stood up. Her knees still hurt, but as she slipped the letter into her pocket alongside Silas's lavender, the pain felt different. It was no longer a weight. It was a fire. She looked at the seafoam socks, the GD unlikely hero armor she would soon wear. Emily, Hannah said, her voice steadying for the first time in 30 years. Keep that phone ready. The GD Justice and Redemption hook was no longer just a hope. It was a plan. The grand dining room of the Miller estate was a masterclass in intimidation. High ceilings draped in shadows, heavy velvet curtains that stifled the sounds of the city, and a table of polished mahogany that stretched like a long, dark lake between the guests. Crystal chandeliers cast a flickering, amber light over the faces of Boston's elite, making their smiles look like sharpened ivory. This was the ancestors' remembrance, and for Hannah it was the GD Justice and Redemption Hook Theater where she played the role of the invisible servant. Julian Thorne, a senior partner at Thomas's law firm. He is a man of calculated silence and expensive cigars whose presence signifies the high stakes of the evening's social performance. Hannah moved around the table with a gait that had become a rhythmic struggle. Each step sent a sensation like white-hot needles through her swollen knees. A physical, GD, emotion-based hook that throbbed in time with her heartbeat. She felt Long Chong, unsteady, as she navigated the narrow space between the heavy chairs. The GD transformation hook she had felt earlier, sparked by her mother's letter, was currently buried under the immediate necessity of survival. The dinner had been a grueling sequence of courses, each one a test of her endurance. As the main plates were cleared, the air in the room shifted. But Catherine leaned forward, her diamonds catching the light like frozen tears. Thomas, Catherine said, her voice cutting through the polite hum of Julian Thorne's conversation. I noticed the lemon tart had a certain grainy texture. Did Hannah forget to sift the sugar again? Thomas didn't look at his wife, who was currently balancing a heavy silver tray of used crystal. He simply sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. She has been distracted all day, Mother. Clumsy with the jars, slow with the prep. I suppose one can only expect so much when the foundation of one's upbringing is so rustic. Lydia chimed in from the far end of the table, her voice a sharp, melodic sting. Oh, don't be too hard on her, Thomas. It's hard to teach a Providence sparrow to sing like a Boston swan. I saw her mother once, years ago. A very simple woman. I imagine the concept of a formal remembrance was quite foreign to her. The table erupted into soft, polite chuckles. This was the GD unlikely hero hook in reverse. The family casting Hannah as the person who failed to rise to their level. Hannah's hands tightened on the edges of the silver tray. The GD silent voice hook was screaming inside her, but she remained motionless, her eyes fixed on the centerpiece. That is exactly the point, isn't it? Ba Catherine continued, her gaze landing on Hannah like a cold weight. Education isn't just about books, it's about the soul. Hannah's mother clearly lacked the refinement to pass on any true sense of duty. To leave a daughter so ill-equipped for the demands of a legacy like ours? It's a tragedy of breeding, really. Hannah felt her knees buckle slightly. The pain was no longer just a dull ache. It was a sharp, stabbing, GD emotion-based hook that made her vision blur. She reached for the heavy tea service on the sideboard, her fingers trembling. As she lifted the tray, weighted with a heavy silver teapot and delicate porcelain cups, the room seemed to tilt. She stumbled. The tray rattled violently, the porcelain clinking like a frantic warning. Emily, sitting near the end of the table, half rose from her seat, her hand going to her pocket where her phone continued to record. Julian Thorne paused mid-sentence, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance at the disruption. Careful, Hannah, Thomas barked, his face reddening with embarrassment. Must you be so dramatic with your exhaustion? It's a tea service, not a mountain. Hannah caught her balance, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The seafoam socks in her pocket felt like they were glowing. A GD, miracle, faith-based hook reminder of a love that didn't require perfection. But Catherine wasn't finished. She set her napkin down with a deliberate, final snap. The room went deathly silent. "It is a matter of lineage," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more power than a shout. "You can dress a commoner in silk, Thomas, but you cannot hide the scent of the docks. This is the problem with these miraculous transformations we hear about. At the end of the day, a Tudong, Doitup Kem, a person of lower lineage, can never truly understand the Ton Nangiem, the absolute dignity of the Miller name. They will always be a guest in a house they do not deserve to inhabit." Hannah stopped. She was standing at the head of the lake, the silver tray held between her cracked, dish-stained hands. The tray began to run Lin Ban Bat, to shake violently, not from the weakness of her knees, but from the sheer volcanic pressure of 30 years of suppressed GD silent voice hook energy. The GD Justice and Redemption hook was no longer a plan Emily had recorded on a phone. It was a physical force radiating from Hannah's chest. The GD called a faith hook she had felt in the kitchen. The faith in her mother's sea-salted blood rose up to meet the cold Boston air. She didn't lower the tray. She didn't apologize. She simply stood there, the center of the Miller world, her eyes finally locking onto Catherine's icy gaze with a clarity that made the matriarch blink. The silence in the room was no longer stifling. It was a vacuum waiting for a storm. The silver tray, once a symbol of Hannah's servitude, now rattled with a rhythmic, percussive force that silenced the room. Every face at the mahogany table was frozen, a gallery of portraits etched in shock. But Catherine's mouth was slightly agape, her icy composure fracturing like thin glass. Thomas sat paralyzed, his fork halfway to his mouth, as he stared at the woman he thought he had successfully hollowed out. Hannah did not wait for them to speak. With a deliberate, agonizingly slow movement, she lowered the tray onto the table, right in front of Catherine. The porcelain clattered against the wood, a harsh sound that felt like a declaration of war. Then Hannah reached behind her waist. The knot of her apron, tied every morning at 4 a.m. for 30 years, came undone. She peeled the stained, white fabric from her body, the apron that had absorbed 30 years of grease, tears, and balsamic vinegar, and cast it onto the floor. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. For the first time in 3 decades, the guests saw Hannah not as a servant, but as a woman wearing the seafoam wool socks Emily had brought, standing tall despite the fire in her knees. "Hannah, what is the meaning of this theater?" Thomas finally roared, standing so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. "Pick that up and get to the kitchen immediately." Hannah didn't flinch. She looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze no longer a silent voice, but a justice and redemption hook that struck with the force of a tidal wave. "No, Thomas," she said, her voice steady and resonant. "This is the last meal I will ever prepare for a Miller. This house is a mausoleum of dead traditions, and I am finished being the ghost that haunts it." At that moment, the heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open with a bang. Emily walked in, followed by a young man the guests had never seen. Detective Miller. Not a relative, but a courier Emily had hired. A lean man in a tan suit with a weary face that suggested he had seen the worst of human nature and was no longer surprised by it. Behind them, they weren't carrying silver platters. They were carrying stacks of greasy cardboard boxes, bright red and yellow containers that smelled of salt, frying oil, and mass production. Emily began placing them on the table, right next to the fine bone china. "What is this? This filth!" Catherine gasped, recoiling as a box of extra crispy fried chicken was set before her. "It's dinner, grandmother," Emily said, her voice dripping with a sharp, transformation hook irony. "Since you believe Mom is so rustic and clumsy, we thought we'd bring the meal down to the level you think she occupies." Hannah leaned over the table, her hands flat on the mahogany. "Since you believe your lineage is so superior, Thomas, let us see how it tastes when it's served in cardboard. From this night on, let your ton ngim, your precious dignity, feast on industrial fried chicken and cold pizza. I am taking my hands back." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Julian Thorne looking as if he wished he could vanish into the velvet curtains. Thomas was purple with rage, but before he could speak, Hannah reached into the hidden pocket of her skirt. She pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope and slid it across the table toward her husband. "This is the miracle and faith-based hook I have found, Thomas," Hannah said, her eyes burning with a transformation hook fire. "Not a miracle from your ancestors, but a miracle of my own will." Thomas tore the envelope open. His hands began to shake as he read the first page. It wasn't just a petition for divorce, signed and notarized. Behind it was a meticulously detailed justice and redemption hook ledger, 30 years of line-item labor. "What is this?" Thomas stammered. You're suing me?" "I am billing you," Hannah corrected. "Emily and I spent months calculating every hour of domestic labor, every holiday spent on my knees, every ancestor's remembrance, where I worked as an unpaid professional chef. We've calculated the market rate for a live-in housekeeper, a private chef, and a personal assistant in the city of Boston, adjusted for 30 years of inflation." She looked at Bea Catherine, who was staring at the ledger as if it were a venomous snake. "And I've included the emotion-based hook damages, the medical costs for the knee surgeries I was denied, and the emotional trauma of being forbidden from my mother's deathbed." "This is millions," Thomas whispered, his face turning an ashen gray. "This would liquidate the trust. It would ruin the Miller name." "Then the Miller name was built on a debt it couldn't afford to pay," Hannah replied. "You treated me like a silent voice for 30 years, assuming I would never find the words to ask for what I am owed." Emily stepped forward, tapping her phone screen. "And Dad, just so you know, I've recorded every unlikely hero hook insult you and Grandmother have hurled at her today. The lawyers call it evidence of a hostile domestic environment. If you don't settle that bill quietly, the whole of Beacon Street will hear exactly how the distinguished Millers treat their own." Hannah turned toward the door, her head held high. The call to faith hook was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. She didn't look back at the grease-stained table or the broken people sitting around it. She looked at Emily, and for the first time in 30 she saw a future that didn't involve a kitchen. "Let's go, Emily," Hannah said. "Providence is calling." The transformation hook was complete. Hannah walked out of the Miller brownstone, her seafoam socks soft against the floor, leaving the wicked to sit among their fried chicken and their crumbling legacy, finally forced to face the justice and redemption they had spent a lifetime avoiding. The taillights of Emily's car faded into the thick Boston mist, two crimson embers vanishing toward the south. Inside the vehicle, Hannah leaned her head against the cool glass of the window. The GD transformation hook was no longer a dream. It was the hum of the tires against the asphalt. For the first time in 30 years, she was not calculating the timing of a roast or the starch in a shirt. She was simply breathing. The seafoam socks her mother had knitted felt like an anchor of reality in a world that had suddenly become vast and lawless. "We're almost to the state line, Mom," Emily whispered, her hand resting over Hannah's. "Providence is waiting." Back at the Miller brownstone, the silence that followed the slamming of the front door was not peaceful. It was a vacuum. The GD Justice and Redemption hook had left a wreckage of cardboard grease and shattered pride. The guests had fled like rats from a sinking ship, leaving Thomas and Bea Catherine alone in the cavernous dining room. Thomas stood by the mahogany table, staring at the half-eaten box of fried chicken that sat atop his ancestors' fine linen. He felt a sudden, sharp craving for the calming ritual of his evening espresso, the one Hannah always placed at his elbow without being asked. He marched into the kitchen, his silk robe billowing, only to stop dead in his tracks. The kitchen, usually a sanctuary of sterile perfection, was a battlefield. Shards of glass from the balsamic jar still hid under the toe kicks. The heavy copper pots were piled in the sink, dull and greasy. Thomas approached the high-end Italian espresso machine, a gleaming beast of chrome and buttons that he had purchased to impress guests but had never once touched. He pressed a button. Nothing happened. He turned a dial. A hiss of steam erupted, scalding his hand, but no coffee emerged. He realized with a jolt of GD, emotion-based hook panic, that he didn't know where the beans were kept. He didn't know how to prime the pump. For 30 years, the unlikely hero of his life had performed 1,000 tiny miracles a day, and he had been too blind to realize that he didn't even know how to feed himself. "Thomas, why is it so cold in here?" Bay Catherine's voice wafted in from the hallway, stripped of its usual melodic steel. Mrs. Gable, the Miller's long-standing neighbor from 3 houses down, a woman with a sharp nose for scandal and a habit of walking in through unlocked side doors when she hears a commotion. Mrs. Gable poked her head into the kitchen, her eyes widening at the sight of the disheveled Thomas and the chaotic counters. Good heavens, Thomas, I saw Hannah leaving with suitcases. Is everything all right? And why is your thermostat humming like a jet engine? Thomas ignored her, stalking toward the basement stairs. The house was growing frigid. The ancient, complex boiler system that heated the 4-story brownstone was clanking. He reached for the thermostat on the wall, a digital interface Hannah had mastered years ago, and realized he didn't know the passkey. He tried to force the dial, and with a sickening crack, the plastic housing snapped. Upstairs, Bay Catherine was having her own GD transformation hook and reverse, a descent into helplessness. She had gone to the laundry room to find a fresh pashmina, only to find the high-tech washing machine mid-cycle, frozen with an error code. The room smelled of damp wool and neglected labor. She reached for a cabinet, looking for her silk wraps, and realized she had no idea which closet Hannah used for the winter linens. The GD silent voice hook of the house was now a deafening scream of absence. Catherine sat on a stool in the laundry room, surrounded by piles of sorted whites and delicates, and for the first time in her life, she looked old. She looked at her manicured hands and realized they were useless. "I can't find the spare keys, Thomas," Catherine cried out as he stumbled back upstairs, his hands covered in soot from the boiler room. "The side gate is locked, and the delivery for the morning flowers will be trapped outside." Thomas stopped in the foyer. He looked at the bowl where the spare keys were supposed to be. It was empty. Hannah had taken the GD call to faith literally. She had taken the keys to the kingdom with her. He reached for his phone to call her, but his thumb hovered over the screen. He remembered the GD justice and redemption ledger she had left on the table. He was a man who lived by the law, and the law said he was a bankrupt soul. The CAO trow, the climax of the night was not a shout, but a slow, cold realization. The Miller brownstone, once a monument to Bostonian ton niem, dignity, was becoming a tomb. Without Hannah's hands to polish the silver, the air itself seemed to tarnish. Without her silent voice to coordinate the hidden mechanics of their lives, the grand house was just a collection of cold bricks and broken machines. Thomas looked at the shattered thermostat and the unmade espresso. He realized he didn't even know how Hannah liked her own coffee. He didn't know the name of the doctor who treated her knees. He was a stranger in his own home, a king without a single servant left to tell him he was wearing a crown. As a pipe burst in the upstairs bathroom, sending a steady drip, drip, drip onto the priceless Persian rug in the library, Thomas Miller sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase and put his head in his hands. The GD emotion-based hook of his own making was finally closing in. The house was falling apart, and he was the one who had pulled the thread. The air in Providence carried the sharp, clean scent of the salt marshes and the honeyed sweetness of wild lavender, a stark contrast to the heavy, oil-choked fog of Beacon Street. In the small, cedar-shingled cottage that once belonged to her mother, Hannah sat by a sun-drenched window. The morning light filtered through white lace curtains, dancing over the keys of a restored Steinway upright piano. It had been 6 months since she walked out of the Miller brownstone, and the GD transformation hook was finally manifest in her every movement. She no longer limped with the jagged, bone-on-bone agony of the past. Using a portion of the settlement funds, the justice and redemption hook payment for 30 years of invisible labor, she had undergone the surgery she was so long denied. Her knees, now rebuilt and strong, felt like a miracle of modern medicine and personal will, a true healing journey from pain to happiness. Dr. Eris Thorne, a gentle, silver-haired orthopedic surgeon in Providence who treated Hannah not as a disheveled hostess, but as a woman with a life worth reclaiming. He was the first to tell her that her pain was real and her recovery was a priority. Hannah's fingers, once cracked by lie and stiffened by the cold of the Miller kitchen, had rediscovered their silent voice. As she played a soft Chopin nocturne, the music flowed through the cottage, blending with the fragrance of the lavender garden Emily had helped her plant. She had opened a small music school, just 5 students from the neighborhood, teaching them that music was not a performance for guests, but a language for the soul. This was her miracle faith-based hook. Her faith in her own talent had been restored after decades of being told she was merely a rustic addition to a Boston lineage. Leo, an 8-year-old boy from down the street, Hannah's first student. He has wide, curious eyes and a habit of bringing Hannah a single seashell every Tuesday before his lesson. He represents the new generation Hannah is nurturing with kindness rather than demand. Between lessons, Hannah reconnected with the life she had been forced to abandon. She had lunch with Sarah, her sister, and joined a local community choir. She learned the GD call to faith hook was not found in a dusty ancestor's remembrance, but in the simple act of loving oneself. She spent her evenings walking along the shore, the sea-foam socks her mother knitted keeping her warm, her head held high as she listened to the silent voice of the waves. The peace of a Tuesday afternoon was interrupted by the sound of a luxury sedan pulling up the gravel driveway. The engine cut out, and a heavy silence followed. From her piano bench, Hannah saw the silhouette of a man through the screen door. Thomas Miller looked smaller than he had in Boston. His suit was wrinkled, his silver hair was uncharacteristically mussed, and he carried himself with the slumped shoulders of a man who had finally realized his toning was a hollow shell. He had been living in a house of broken machines and cold rooms, a justice and redemption hook reality where the wicked were finally forced to feel the weight of their own neglect. "Hannah," he said, his voice cracking as he stood on the porch. He didn't wait for her to invite him in. He saw the piano, the flowers, and the woman who looked 10 years younger, and the emotion-based hook of his loss finally broke him. Thomas sank to his knees, the very position he had forced Hannah into for 30 years. He reached for the hem of her skirt, his eyes wet with a GD call to faith that came far too late. "Please, Hannah, the house, it's falling apart. My mother's miserable. I'm miserable. I didn't know how much you did. I'll do anything. I'll pay any amount. Just come back. I'm lost without you." Hannah stopped playing. She didn't feel anger. She felt a profound, liberating pity. She looked at the man who had been her killer in the kitchen, and she realized he was the one who was truly low lineage, not because of his birth, but because of his inability to love. She reached into the pocket of her linen dress and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of paper. She didn't offer him her hand to help him up. Instead, she placed the paper on the piano lid. "I'm not a savior anymore, Thomas," she said, her voice a silent voice that was now as clear as a bell. "I'm an artist, I'm a teacher, and I am a daughter of Providence." Thomas looked at the paper. It wasn't a letter of reconciliation. It was a hand-drawn map. On it, Hannah had marked 3 locations with precise ink: a local laundromat, a high-end grocery store with a prepared food section, and a professional cleaning service. "This is your GD transformation hook, Thomas," Hannah said with a gentle, final smile. "Your lesson is only just beginning. You spent 30 years assuming my service was your birthright. Now, you must learn to survive your own life. As for me, I am far too busy living mine." She turned back to the piano and began to play a bright, ascending scale. The music drowned out his pleas, rising up to meet the salt air. Thomas Miller stood up, clutching the map to the laundromat, and walked back to his cold, expensive car. The GD Justice and Redemption hook was complete. The house in Boston remained a monument to the past, but the cottage in Providence was a cathedral of the future. Hannah leaned into the music, her rebuilt knees steady, her heart finally at peace in the lavender-scented light of her own making. Through the journey of Hannah, we learn a profound moral lesson for our daily lives. Sacrifice only holds true meaning when it is built upon a foundation of mutual respect and love. Never mistake silent endurance for a lack of worth, for when you lose sight of your own value, you inadvertently teach others that they may treat you with indifference. Remember, your hands were meant to create beauty, and your feet were meant to walk your own path, not to wither away in the service of those who refuse to see your soul. If Hannah's story of transformation and courage has touched your heart today, please show your support by liking and sharing this video with the incredible women in your life. Your comments and stories are the heartbeat of this channel, so please share your thoughts below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to join our community as we continue to share journeys of faith and personal growth. Dear Lord, we ask for your grace to cover every person listening to this message today. Please grant strength to the weary, comfort to the brokenhearted, and clarity to those seeking their own path to freedom. May you bless our viewers with a spirit of resilience and remind them that they are never truly alone on their journey. Fill their lives with the fragrance of peace and the light of your justice. If you believe that God still performs miracles and guides us toward the light, please type Amen in the comments below to share in this blessing. Thank you for being part of our story, and may you find the strength to live your own truth.